Hello, and welcome to Unit 1 in Introduction to Philosophy. The first two questions we need to ask ourselves when studying pretty much any topic, but especially one in the humanities, is what is the subject and why should we be studying it? In this case, of course, what we're going to be looking at is what is philosophy and why should we study philosophy? First of all, let's look at a fairly literal definition of what philosophy is or how philosophy is defined. It's a combination word made of two smaller Greek words. This is very helpful, by the way, if you are studying any kind of arts, humanities, literature, to know the Latin and Greek origins of a word. I even noticed in the spelling bee championships that I watched recently, I promise I don't do that normally, but a friend had turned me on to watching a particular spelling bee competition at the national level. One question you can ask, kind of like one of your make a phone calls in Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, is what is the origin of the word? So, for example, if you don't know how to spell something, you could ask the judge, what is the origin? And he'll say, or she'll say, it's a Latin root. And a lot of times that will tip off a really good speller as to what the subwords are, what the root words are. And from that alone, they know what the English word, how it would be spelled. And also we derive a lot of meaning. For example, if you're ever going to go into medical school, business school, law school, these Greek and Latin roots are very important. They actually tell you what the word means at a more basic level than sometimes we use it in English. So with philosophy, the first Greek word is phila, or philia, and that's a Greek word meaning love, but I want to qualify that a little bit. It's easy to say that it's a Greek word meaning love, but it's a particular type of love. In English, we're a little bit sloppy with the word love. We translate several non-English words into the English word love. In Greek, the different affections were a bit more specific. For example, if you love your country or your nation or your people, that was storge. It was a kind of nationalism or love of the nation, love of your group, your tribe. So if I said, like, I love my country, there would be one word for that. Or if I was looking at a particularly attractive person and I said, I love the way he looks or she looks, there's a separate word for that. It's specifically eros, from which we get the word erotic. That meant something more like inflaming the passions or the love of the beautiful, the exciting, the untempered. In this case, the specific word we're looking at is phila. It has a kind of sense of duty or of family. In other words, it's a love in a familiar sense. So, like the examples here, I love my job, not I love you, baby, right? So to say phila, that's the first thing we need to look at is the particular Greek word here, the particular love that is being used is not a passionate or an emboldened or a nationalistic or a spiritual love. It's a very familiar, duty-oriented love. And that's really what I want you the word I want you to think of. It's a sense of duty. It's a love in the way you love your brother or sister, not in a way you love a girlfriend or boyfriend. So this is why, in fact, Philadelphia, which is also starts with phila, right, is the city of brotherly love, because it's the phila is brotherly love in that context, which I think is a good way to think of it. Brotherly, familiar, platonic love. And Delphos, which is city. The other word is Sophia, meaning wisdom. I've got a little picture here off to the right to show you a Middle Ages depiction of wisdom personified. This was very common in Greco-Roman times, and even before that with the Egyptians and Babylonians, to personify or try to visualize the virtues or the vices. So Sophia at times you will see as a statue of a woman, a wise woman, and that has other meanings as well, dealing with Greek notions of masculine and feminine. But basically what I'm getting at here is if you put them together, what you're going to get is philosophy means the love of wisdom, or as I'm suggesting more precisely, the familiar love of wisdom, or the duty to pursue wisdom. And I think that's actually the best. Normally, if a person says, what is the definition of philosophy, or what does it mean in Greek, philosophia, they will say it means love of wisdom. But I think in English, because of our less specific way of speaking, it's perhaps better to say philosophy means the duty to pursue wisdom. So taking this love of wisdom, or the duty to pursue wisdom, it actually stimulates more questions, right? I mean, if I were to say to you, do you love wisdom? You would probably come back with, what does that mean? Or, what are you really getting at specifically? First, let's begin with some bad ways of understanding it, or some misconceptions. Now, one thing I hope that you really take out of philosophy, and let's just start now. Most misconceptions are based on true things, or real things, or good ideas. They just don't quite get it together. They don't quite address everything. So a bad definition is not necessarily an opposite of a good definition. It's just a definition that doesn't quite capture everything that needs to be captured. So if you just go out and say to people, what is philosophy to you? You're going to get some of these responses. The first one up there, asking or discussing deep questions. Of the four of these, this is probably the most accurate. It's the most helpful. We do, in fact, ask and discuss deep questions in philosophy, but not every question has to be exceptionally deep to be examined philosophically. In fact, some very mundane conversations or very mundane thoughts that we might have are just as open to philosophical inquiry as anything deep or powerful or spiritual. The other thing that we need to keep in mind is that it's not only questioning, it's not only purely intellectual, but philosophy is something that should inform the way we live, because the way we think and the conclusions that we come to in our philosophical questions need to have a pragmatic aspect to them. That is to say that we don't always just want to sit around discussing deep questions for the sake of discussing deep questions. We want to eventually get to a point where we have, if not answers, at least some ways of handling those big questions that can inform who we are and how we act. Now, another thing someone might say is that it's my outlook, or it's my frame of mind. So someone might say, my philosophy is God helps those who help themselves, something like that. My philosophy is that, spare the rod, spoil the child. This is obviously a little smaller than we would like to encompass. A person's frame of mind is not necessarily their philosophy. It might be a truism or a rule of thumb or a witty thing that they have found helpful. It might be a disposition. In other words, I may be a pessimistic person. Pessimist is one who is always kind of negative, sees the worst in things. But that's not necessarily my philosophy. Like, I'm not necessarily philosophically a cynic. There's actually a group that we will look at called the Cynics, and they had a particular philosophy. I mean, they had a structure. So that's what separates these things, is that philosophy also tries to give a structure from a consistency, a way of thinking from which other things can be viewed. It's not strictly a disposition that we have towards the world. In fact, it might question or call into question the disposition that we have in regards to the rest of the world. So if I'm a cynical person, a philosophical discourse might very well be someone saying to me, you shouldn't be such a cynic, and here's why, right? So it's more based on argumentation than just frames of mind or someone's emotional outlooks. Another thing that someone might say is that it's just personal opinions. My philosophy is my personal opinions, or philosophy is just a question of whatever you think. The problem with that is very much like the frame of mind, in that it assumes that philosophy happens within us, but it has trouble addressing that philosophy involves interaction. It's actually a very poor subject to do in a vacuum. You need the input of others. You need that discourse. As we'll see, most philosophical positions are offered, but then it is by discourse and by exchange, argumentation, that people refine and really find out exactly what they're saying or what they're thinking about a particular topic. And it's not always opinions. I mean, there does need to be, even before we can begin discussing, we need to agree to what the facts are. It's very difficult to argue when two people disagree on the facts. There's a story I used to tell my courses when I was in-class instructor, that if you had one person who was arguing how to fly a plane from New York to Paris, and he believed that the world was flat, and you had another person who was arguing how to fly a plane from New York to Paris, but they believed that the world was spherical, that conversation would go nowhere, because there's a difference in their premises. There's actually a difference in the facts that they're using to make their argument. So before that argument can even take place, they need to resolve that more fundamental disagreement. So philosophy is not just a matter of two people opining. I mean, obviously in that situation, most of us would say there's clearly a right premise and a wrong premise, and we need to get that cleared up before we can continue to discuss. Even if your opinion is that the world is flat, the world may in fact not be flat.